hour, we have to go through and continue our discussion regarding what are the key recommendations to include in the report. And we have to vote and make decisions today, so that a small group volunteered from this committee will work together with me and a budget to put together a report essentially in the next few business days on that. So with that, I will have our consultants start.
Good evening. My name is Dean Bellis with Urban Analytics in Alexandria, Virginia. And with me today is Anya Spartamel, who's on the team. She is with Ardemel and Associates, their urban planning firm in Alexandria, and Dr. Clinch with the University of Baltimore. And so we were hired to analyze the fiscal impacts of the APFO ordinance. And I'm here tonight to present this, our preliminary findings. We're still tweaking some numbers. And so, I'm sorry, Jeff, this is the move forward?
Yes.
Yeah. And so are you going to start with the
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
so I'm going to briefly start with sort of a background of the projections, because I work for Howard County DPZ, Department of Planning and Zoning, so we were responsible for the housing unit and the population and employment projections that we gave to Dean and his team to put into his model to analyze the fiscal impact study. So as you know, the fiscal study was asked to be done at last year's Spending and Affordability Advisory Committee to study the APFO changes. So it's basically studying the impact of the APFO law that was recently changed. We went over this before, but very quickly, what it does, the major thing it does is it reduces the school capacity from 115% when it closed from elementary to 105%. And for middle school, from 115% being closed to 110%, and then adding a new high school test. So that's good. That basically has impacted future growth in the county. So Dean and his team are tasked to basically study the impacts of that. So we have two scenarios, the general plan scenario and then the growth scenario with the amended APFO ordinance in effect. I presented this map a few weeks ago. This basically is a map that shows all the colored areas are the closed school districts based on this change moving forward. So this will be effective in July 2019, we think. This is a preliminary chart. We're going to get the actual final chart from the school system in May. This is based on a feasibility study, and it's very likely that this will be the result. The red is the elementary school districts that will be closed. The blue kind of hash is the middle school districts that are closed, and the red dot is the high school, so they kind of overlap. But what this shows, based on our land use analysis, is about 25% of the growth, 25% of the capacity would be able to move on. About 75% of the projected development would be stopped for 4 years for the APFO provision. So really quickly, just as a recap of what we talked about before, Howard County has been building about 1,500 to 1,700 units on average over the last, since 2001. So that puts this in perspective of how we were planning to move forward. So if you look at the general plan projections, we're still at that around 1,700. It jumped up a few thousand because of downtown Columbia, but we still have around this 1,500 unit average over time. With the amended APFO scenario, we have the same projections, but in 2022 it drops to about 25%. Because in July, when the new chart goes into effect, it's a 3-year chart, so it looks ahead 3 years from 2019 to 2022, because it takes about that length of time for plans to get through the planning process. So they would be stopped in 2019, so they won't show up 3 years later in 2022, so that's why you have this reduction. So overall, if you compare the two, there's about a net loss of 6,300 housing units over the projection time period here, which is a 20-year horizon. This is a graphic of this, and it really shows the distinction. The blue is the general plan. The amended APFO is this orange, and you can see this drop. And you kind of had this 4-year dip because if you recall, we discussed before, projects can be on hold for about 4 years, or can be a maximum of 4 years, and then they get to go forward. So you kind of see this bump up after 4 years, but it's not going to get to the same level, this rolling 4-year hold, because the reality is, in talking to our consultants, a lot of developments aren't even going to apply because they can't carry the cost for 4 years, or they don't want to wait for 4 years. So it's very unlikely that we're going to bump back up over the 4 years. We kind of have this gradual thing. One thing to kind of point out this, we're projected to have relatively strong growth for the next 10 years, and that's in the general plan that was adopted. The general plan also foresaw that we're, in both cases, the county is running out of land, so it's going to slow down in the future. So this discussion of the county's fiscal position in a kind of future slow growth scenario 10 years out it's good to start having that discussion now. But in the immediate 10 years, there's going to be a very large impact, which Dean and his team have analyzed. Of course, we will do another general plan, and that could change the out years. If, for example, part of the general plan policy is to redevelop Gateway to make it like downtown Columbia. I mean, who knows, anything like that can happen. But based on the current land use policy, this is the situation in the county. And then this shows the impact of, this used to be 10% growth, about 32,000 people, this is population. With the impact, it's only going to be 5% growth in this decade. So you can see a significant drop-off in projected population growth from the actual scenario. Overall growth has slowed over time. We had quite a significant amount of growth in the 80s and 90s, and it's slowing over time. But this decade is what we're concerned about, and it's really different from what the general plan had projected initially. And then lastly, we also projected employment. And so the reason that employment is dropped is because if we have less housing units and less people, there's going to be less of a need for retail space, number one. And number two, we kind of looked at the percentage of people that work and live in Howard County, and it's about 60%, actually it's about 40% of people work and live in Howard County. And so if less people are going to be moving in Howard County under this revised scenario, then we drop the proportion of the amount of jobs that would be generated from that, people living here. So you get a net change over the 20-year time period of about 4,500 jobs difference. So both those are put into Dean's model to project the fiscal impacts. And so with that, well done.
Thank you, Jeff. And with everyone's permission, because I walk with the podium, it's a little bit easier for me to sit. Thank you very much. And so,
If you want to point this way.
oh, okay.
Or because you're going to have to pay.
I'm going to
that works.
okay, sure. And this is the same order as the. Thank you.
While he's moving over, can I just ask a question? I know last year, at the beginning of the year, there was a quick study done. Was that this same study?
No.
So this is a different one?
It's different. Dr. Lynch, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, we did a study for the Howard County Economic Development Authority last year, and that was because the bill passed so late and there was only a small time to respond. It was a very quick study that could not do the level of modeling that's done here. So that was a very simple kind of spreadsheet level model of the county's fiscal impacts, whereas this is a very deep dive which Dean's going to go into. So
Okay, great.
this is what we wanted to do back then, but there was no time
Well, and that's why I'm curious.
to do this.
And then, Jeff, when you were talking about this, that 4-year where, they're capped off, they can't do anything, but then after 4 years they can.
Right.
So a project that could have come in and started in 2021, or when this started, is that still now capped? Another 4 years you can't do anything? Or can that one go forward?
So that one can go forward.
Okay, and that's our
4 years max.
So your model counts in those projects that might have been held back?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And by the way, in terms of last study, that was done in a rush. It's a different company, so
Okay.
this one is hired by EDA, done very, very quickly on that there. And this one is, we did a competitive bidding through RFP and select who we think the best for this work, and it's very comprehensive. Every single piece on that was done very
Thank
comprehensive.
you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's easier for me to look at you and look at my slides. If I talk too fast or too slow, just let me know. Again, so we were hired to do an analysis. And it's based on a model that I developed back when I was getting my doctorate many years ago. The model has been tested probably in 30 to 40 jurisdictions around the country since 2005. For this analysis, we're using data from Howard County government's various departments. We've interviewed all the department heads and collected data from the appropriate personnel in the county. We've been working very closely with Holly and Jeff throughout this process, the Department of Planning, Zoning, and Budget. We've calibrated the model to Howard County. So the model is designed to be used in any county in the country, but we've calibrated to all the local financial and socioeconomic factors in Howard County. And we've developed a series of templates so that we can run some what-if sensitivity scenarios in the future. And the last thing, which is a technical issue, but I just wanted to bring it out there, is that we hold this in costs in dollars. We find it's much easier when presenting the findings to an audience that we talk about 2018 dollars instead of talking about dollars deflated into the future. We've made some modifications to the model. Number one, we're doing two separate distinct analyses. One is the marginal impact of new growth only under the general plan and also under the AFO scenario. And then we're also going to do what's called a prototype analysis where we'll look at the entire county and the entire population and housing stock in the county, and we'll run that through the model as well. We've written many equations in the model to account for differences between what average costing and marginal costing and the fiscal impact analysis. That's a technical issue, and I know we're constrained by time this evening, so if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards, you're more than welcome to come up and I'll answer any questions you have. And now we'll jump into the findings. We first started by looking at the impacts on the capital budget, specifically on the transfer tax, the impact on school surcharge tax, and the impact on the road excise tax. And I've made these slides very, very short, sweet, to the point. But please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Impact on transfer, based on the projections that Jeff showed you a few minutes ago and the change in housing units over time. Without AFO under the general plan scenario, we are projecting that you would generate $229.8 million in transfer tax revenues over the next 20 years. With AFO, we're projecting that total transfer tax revenues would be $175.6 million. So a net reduction or foregone revenues as a result of AFO is approximately $54.2 million over the 20-year period.
Although in the modeling, is that proportionally more of that foregone revenue is happening in 4 years from now than it is over the whole life of the model?
That's a very, very good question. We took the projections and made them on an annual basis.
Yeah, that is true. I think that the moratorium period has no significant impact.
Of the 54
And the
million.
4
Yeah.
years you still have, because it takes a long
Yeah.
time to get back to the other line.
But it's a shorter run impact to the fiscal balance of the county because of the moratorium period.
Right.
Do we know what that number is?
Yeah, we will have that.
It's
We'll
coming
show that
later? Okay, I'm
coming
sorry.
later. The other thing I think is a good point to make, since you asked about, there's two types of revenues that the consulting team is looking at. Some, like the transfer tax, school surcharge, and excise tax, those are, the base is zero. Every year, these are only or largely taxed on the new development. So their impact is going to, given time, the annual impact should be smaller, all right, because the two lines get closer. But the income tax, property tax, fire tax, that's different, because you
Well,
lost
that's
the
not in
base
this
in
one.
the base, and next year is going to be more. So given time, those gaps get bigger and bigger until at some point you find these two are huge difference between the original versus amendment, because everything the new development is get into the base, all you lost in the base. So that's a compound.
Thank you, Holly. And the transfer tax. The next slide on school surcharge tax. Under the general plan, we were estimating $96.8 million in revenues collected over the 20-year period. Under the AFO, amended AFO, that drops to $73 million, so a net reduction. I've used the phrase foregone revenue because you haven't actually lost it. That hasn't happened yet, but potential foregone revenue, $23.8 million over the 20-year period. The next slide, please. The impact on the road excise tax. Over 20 years, the foregone revenues, we are estimating them currently to be at $27.2 million. The next slide on debt service, we're working on the impact on debt service based on the new units being built. We didn't present that tonight simply because we're fine-tuning some of the numbers, and we want to make sure that those numbers are correct, and they're coming out shortly, probably in a few days, and it'll be in our report, and so we don't have that here today. Then, to answer your question, we then jump into operating revenues,
Okay, before you get to that, the non-residential impact to long-run revenue, that's because of the reduction, we assume there are less need for retail, other types of
Fewer
businesses,
people,
jobs, okay.
Fewer
So
jobs,
that's why that
there's a relationship between the two. The operating revenues, real estate, we segregated it out to the four major revenues: real estate, property tax, personal income tax, recreation, fire and rescue, and then took all your other revenues and lumped them together in a category called other revenues. That ranges from parking meter charges to animal licenses and fishing licenses to all the revenues that the county collects. The impact on real estate property tax over the 20-year period, without amended, under the general plan, we were projecting to collect roughly $1.6 billion in property tax revenues over the 20-year period. With the amended AFO, that drops to roughly 1.2 billion, so a net reduction or foregone revenues of about $450 million over the 20-year period.
In your assumptions, do you take into account any potential increases in any of the rates?
No, we kept
Everything's constant, today's dollars.
both the rates and the dollars, because,
It's fine, I understand, which I just want to make sure you were doing both ends.
yeah, yes, sir.
Right.
Yes.
At the very, later, we'll have a summary page to summarize the concept. But for sake of the argument on budget, I have another one that's changed to nominal dollar using inflation rate of 2% to account for either income or assessment base change on that. So
Okay.
you will see both.
Okay, thank you very much. The next slide, the impact on personal income tax. Foregone revenues projected over the next 20 years, roughly $250 million. Fewer people, fewer jobs, fewer income tax coming in. Impact on fire and rescue. It's interesting that it's the smallest of the major categories at only 78 million, but as we'll talk later on in the presentation, there's already some issues regarding the fire and rescue fund currently, so, adding another potential foregone amount of 78 million has a greater impact.
And the other thing is, as we mentioned earlier, this is constant dollar, but also not only doesn't factor in potential index or inflation related rate change, but also doesn't account for potential, for example, in this case, fire tax rate might be changed, then it's not factored.
Right. And then again, for all other revenues, what we've done is we've taken all the other revenues, we've aggregated them together, and we've developed a per capita multipliers and per job multipliers. So what is, on average, what is the amount of revenues that the county receives on a per resident basis or a per worker basis? Again, we're fine tuning those numbers. A lot of work that we had to put together and digest.
That's a small percentage of the overall budget.
But it's still an important part.
I mean, we're already at $1 billion, so.
Yeah.
it's just- For those who are doing the math at home.
Yeah, we're,
I can't do
Looking
math.
better and
but
better.
That's what it is. Okay, you're already $1 billion, so what's a couple $100,000 more? Okay, okay. And then, and I apologize for speaking quickly, but I know you're on a very tight time frame tonight. Holly has put together basically a summary table, and I'd like to have her discuss that a little bit because it's your turn.
Oh,
So this is the one, basically summarize all the information coming from the prior slides that Dean already shown. This one just put together in a summary manner in constant dollar. The second column talk about FY 20 to 39, 20-year total. All these number matches what Dean discussed earlier. And as as Steve mentioned earlier, the total is roughly $910 million, close to $1 billion here. And then for operating budget alone, it's about $800 million. But I would say that because this one is only on constant dollar, we come up with, we're building a little bit inflation, 2% a year, to account for the fact that the price does change and the income and the wage does change. So this is probably more relevant when we talk about true multi-year revenue projection. And if you look at this, it's true, it's 1.2 billion total in the next 20 years in total impact. On the capital budget side, there's a total of $121 million impact. The operating budget have a little more than $1 billion. That's for the next 20 years. More imminently, in the next 6-year total between operating and CIP, within the to lose or foregone revenue is estimated $138 million. And if you look at individual years, FY '23 is a year that we start to see the full impact and followed by the next few years. And as we mentioned earlier, CIP and the operating budget, different revenue sources, they're in different trend. On the top, these are operating budget, property tax, income tax, their impact get compounded as years goes on, the base change more, become more significant between the two scenarios on that, so that's why you see the number that get become bigger. For the capital, it's different because transfer school surcharge, they're more directly linked to new school surcharge, new development. So given time, after some time, that gap starts to close a little bit, although that will continue for a while. So in general, this is pretty significant. So what does that mean to our revenue picture? I mean, I briefed the committee some time ago, so I just want to refresh your memory and let you know what's the consequence. For general fund, we mentioned earlier, the multiple projection already show a gap starting from FY '20, and the gap is going to get bigger in the next several years because expenditures have been trending faster than revenues there. And I also want to give you a quick update that the board just approved their request for the county, and with that, the anticipated deficit in FY 2020 dropped from $133 million to $108 million based on latest request, because what the board request was representing about 15% of county funding increase versus 21% in the superintendent's request. And here I listed what is the board approved above maintenance amount versus what historically has been given. So it definitely is lower compared to the superintendent's one, and one step moved in a more downward direction, but still obviously probably still way beyond what would realistically be funded in this fiscal year. And for general fund there also, we showed the group earlier that the next 6-year projection in general of the county are expected to have an average growth of slightly under 3%. And with this scenario, if the actual amendment stay as it is, then with this kicking a couple years down the road, the average growth in that period will drop back to close to 2%. And so you see the difference between the two. And that's going to make it really difficult because, as you know, that each year the debt service, between the debt service growth and the maintenance effort alone probably takes 2% already. So that means like with the Apple scenario, amendment scenario, literally in the typically you have $0 or close to $0 left to support any service in the county, and you would keep funding. We also mentioned to you earlier about the fire fund structural problem. Again, before we talk about Apple, we already anticipate a significant problem because the structural deficit embedded in this fund and the rate hasn't been changed for multiple years there. And given time, that structural deficit is going to grow to very big to almost $150 million in the next 6 years on that. With Apple amendment there, it's projected that there will be foregone revenue of about $100 million in 20 years. And more immediately, and in the next 6 years, the structural gap every year between revenue and expenditure is going to be expanded to over $44 million. So that's going to make this fund in the worst scenario. Talking about the capital, this slide we discussed earlier, and just to refresh everybody's memory, our G bond already was stressed because of not only that it's likely to, the debt indicator is likely to exceed our self-imposed policy target, but also we're going to have less new revenue left after paying for the debt service to support the rest of the county's service there. But more importantly, for our discussion today, those other funds is going to be further stressed there. Not only the fact that normally the county issued a bond and is counting on using future year's revenue to support those funds, which leaves hardly any capacity for the revenue coming to sponsor any new project, but also with Apple impact, the total foregone resources, including transfer tax, surcharge, and road exercise, will likely to be $120 million in the next 20 years. So that's going to put some of those models in red almost right away. So take school surcharge road exercise test. Not only next 20 years, we cannot use those revenue source to support any new project, but also we don't even have sufficient to pay off the debt we issued many years ago.
Holly, question for you.
Yeah.
In the modeling related to how we're seeing development happen, you know, we assume the four-year moratorium for something, that's the longest we can hold them. We can do it. What are we assuming for growth in school construction? Like, are we assuming that we won't build any more schools for this period of time, and therefore the only development will be because people have gone past the 4 years? Or are we assuming a level of growth that will be consistent with what we're seeing now?
We'll do it proportionately. That part of the model hasn't been completed
Okay.
yet, but it'll be based on average debt per student. So
Okay.
less students with less homes will create less expenditures. So there is an assumption that there will be, again, this is to focus on the marginal impacts,
Yeah, I understand.
but your point is well taken, that there's still capital needs, right? So
Yeah.
from a budget standpoint, it may be the case that there's still those needs for those schools to be rebuilt and to, you know, what's in the capital budget.
I mean, because you could look at it and say, okay, for us to not impact this at all, right? For us to say, yes, we passed this, but we're gonna get to the point where we have it could cost us $1.5 billion in school construction, and then let alone the increased operating costs and everything like that to run the schools. And you say, okay, well, if it's gonna cost us $1.5 billion to do it over that same period, and we're gonna lose foregone revenue of $1 billion, well, it makes sense to do this than it does to build the schools. You could make that argument.
Yeah, so there is.
Although
less
it's
budget.
That's the next
then it's
step.
a 40 or
actually.
50 year
Yeah,
foregone
you're
revenue.
right.
That's
Actually,
the
that's
point,
the next step they're working on. We haven't finished it today because most of focusing on around.
Well, I'm always asking the
they're
question
working
for
on.
next thing.
Yes, you go over the next slides, basically. Which is good. So that's just a revenue picture, and Dean's gonna talk about where we are on the expenditure and what's the process and methodology approach on that.
But not expenditure for capital.
No, including
Oh, you
the
did capital
approach
too?
on that,
Okay.
yes. He's gonna talk about.
It's a very interesting
Yeah,
question.
I'll be honest, yeah.
So we will be looking at the operating expenditures. We've already started that analysis. Again, as we put this, all the expenditures, we looked at school debt service, we looked at all the other debt service in the county, and then we've rolled up into one ball, all the other expenditures in the county from public safety, public works, parks and recreation, and so forth, and developed per capita, per child, and per student multipliers. So we can now take those multipliers and apply them to housing units and people occupying those housing units and jobs occupying non-residential space. We don't have that for you today. We focused for tonight's meeting on getting all the revenues done because that's a major component of this. It took a lot of work. We've really taken our, I want to say taken our time, but we've made sure to cross the T's and dot the I's and make sure that we haven't missed anything. And the expenditure categories are coming out shortly. I think about another week we should be, if not sooner, those should be wrapped up.
Dean, you might want to just talk a little bit about the approach, because, the number's not available, but the approach on how you calculate the capital and.
So what we do is the fiscal impact model we have is a land use model. It's not, some models in the country are based on linear regression analysis based on historical revenues, and they just regress it forward into the future. But what this model, it was developed when I was working on my doctoral degree years ago, is based on people living in different types of housing units, single-family townhomes versus apartments versus condominium, or workers working in retail space versus office space or manufacturing, or even working for not-for-profit organizations like religious organizations or government entities, right? We can calculate the impact that the county will face on growth by how the county's physical growth occurs. How much housing stock is built, or how much retail space is built. And to do that, we have found by looking at all the models that have been developed over the past 75, 80 years, we found that the best way to do this is on a per capita basis or on a per job basis, because we directly tie that to people. And so as our projections for population grow in the future, either, you know, up or down, and same with jobs and corresponding to housing units, we can then actually, with a high degree of accuracy, measure how growth will affect revenue. So the per capita has been tested, method has been tested throughout the country, and what we do is we take the comprehensive annual financial report, the audited financial statements of the county, because they've been audited, and we use that as our base to develop a baseline scenario. The base year is 2018, and from 2018 we go out 20 years. And we then run the scenarios through the model. And so the first step in the approach is we take revenues and expenditures and we try to determine who generates those revenues versus who demands services from the county. So for certain revenue items like real estate, income tax, personal property tax, we know specifically where those revenues come from the residential side of the county or the non-residential side. But for other areas, like parking meters, I use that as an example only because it's an easy example, even though it's not a lot of money. I mean, and if I come to the county and I have a business meeting, you know, and I put money in a parking meter, are you charging that against businesses because it's a business meeting, or am I coming to visit people and it's really being charged against residential? So we have to take a detailed approach to try to determine where revenue comes from by land use type. That has historically been very, very difficult, and most of the models that have been developed over the past 70 years, 75 to 80 years, really haven't done a good job because the assumptions behind them, one, were a little weak. Number two, they didn't have the computational methodology available to calculate very, very large quantities of numbers.
And Dean, sorry, I just want to add something to make sure that we understand that. For on the expenditure side.
Yeah.
Because I know like you, for your calculations of that is essentially answers some of the question about, you also counted per pupil because the new development, there's certain index, what type of house
Right.
generate how many pupils based on different type of house, and then based on the pupils cost, per pupil cost on operating side and the capital and debt service cost, that's what you're going to do.
Yes, and so you can ask the question, okay, you know, do we need another high school? But another way to answer that, you know, and you can answer that by saying, okay, you know, locate that school or that elementary school. Another way through the model is just to calculate what that fair share contribution would be on a per student basis. So we may not know exactly what year you're going to build a new school, but at least we'll know that there's a capital cost involved. And as the projections will change from year to year, either under general plan or under AFO, we can quantify that for you.
But again, I understand that. My question is, the model says, here's the impact of growth. The new growth is based on the restrictions that we have today.
And they will also do the foregone cost.
No. That's what, if I'm asking something that's, I'm maybe a little outside I'm just trying to understand it. If we are projecting growth, we're making an assumption, your model makes an assumption that growth, however it is, comes with this many students.
Yes.
This many students, when you aggregate them together at some point, because of the 105, the 110, 150, are going to require a new school.
Yes.
So therefore,
Right.
so what this says is that we are now bound by, in the model, bound by that level of growth in our capital planning, as opposed to saying, if we wanted to accelerate growth, right? AFO is adequate public. If we wanted to accelerate the growth and call back some of that foregone revenue,
Right.
the team will have the information to say, if
Yes.
we do that,
Right.
this is how it'll adjust.
Right. So we
So
have.
then you can do a case analysis on,
Right.
should we build another school in this district?
Right,
To accelerate growth.
And further down in the PowerPoint deck is, there's a slide on future scenarios. And so basically, we're setting up the models from a methodological perspective, right? There's no second guessing, okay? And so you can run a series of sensitivity analyses. You ask the question, as long as it's a question that we can quantify, right? Then we can run that scenario through the model and say, okay, if you do this, option A versus option B versus option C, the model will give you an answer. And the answer, of course, is in dollars because it's, and so from my perspective as an economist, is that I'm really concerned with the methodology. As long as the methodology is correct and the model is set up and calibrated and working properly for the county, then it's a policy decision that this group
If
makes.
the county, whoever's gonna, I just,
Yeah.
my question was, they'll have the tool to
Yes.
say,
Yeah.
you know, Jeff was looking at something and
Right.
say, hey, we're
Yeah.
looking at the next general plan
Right,
in,
Right.
I guess, next year, we have to look at the next 10-year
So our
plan.
thinking is that we could perhaps use this model
Exactly.
with, for the general plan.
And then say, if we wanted to accelerate this
Yes.
growth, but
Yeah.
still meet the obligations of the new
Right.
law,
And use the
this is the
scenarios.
investment we need to
And
make.
part of the scope also is to, and it's sort of related to your question, is this is just studying the marginal impacts of growth.
Yeah.
We're gonna do a scenario of including the existing base, what happens.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I will-
And the changes of that base.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
okay, great. And so, you've heard enough about me so far, so I'm gonna turn this over to Agnes in the next slide. And Agnes is gonna talk a little bit about where we are today and what the next steps are.
Okay, so we've been working very hard to have something to show you, but as you saw, there are a couple of things missing, so our next step is really to finish the expenditure analyses and a couple of other things, but once we have all the parts together, what we really need to do is to make sure that everything is absolutely correct. You know, as you develop any piece of software, you've got to go through a debugging stage because things creep in there, and, you know, so we will spend some time making sure that everything's working properly and everything makes sense. Because our intention has been to create a model that can be used to answer many questions. So we're not doing it back of the envelope, we're not taking shortcuts. It's very detailed, but it has incredible flexibility built in to change the input data. And that's why it's taken a little bit longer than we had hoped. So after the validation stage, we will then replicate the model for the 5 Howard County planning areas, which are already defined and used in all the planning department analyses, and see what happens in each of the separate areas within the county. At that point, it will also be available for specific scenarios and a prototype analysis.
And the prototype is including the base.
The base, right. So we anticipate that county departments, your committee, and others will have questions, so we'll make sure that we're able to answer those questions, and we will prepare a detailed report that includes not only methodology, but also documenting the assumptions that were made, along with lots of tables and charts. So it's a very tedious reading, but if you want to consult it like an encyclopedia, it'll all be there. And then finally, there are probably some stakeholder groups in the county that would like to hear about the results or certain aspects of the results, so we'll be able to make those presentations as well. So right now, we're doing the basic analysis, looking at the adopted general plan, and then showing the impact of the after ordinance. Those are the things we discussed tonight. But in the future, this model will be available for sensitivity analyses, and we can plug in what if we change this tax rate, or whatever other parameters are of interest, so that you have a really good sense of the fiscal impact of various options. And then Dean will give you some.
And so to wrap this up, Holly and Jeff asked us to talk a little bit about our experiences in other communities. And in summary, we've done this many times throughout the country. And the general findings we've seen over the years is that new housing, new housing from a fiscal perspective tends to subsidize existing housing. Why is that? Today, new homes are being built at larger sizes than they were in years past. I use the example of my own house. My home was built in 1959, and back in 1959, a 1,300 square foot home was a mansion. Today, it's like a doghouse. I'm not trying to be, it is what it is. Construction costs are higher. Quality of the construction materials are higher, more expensive. These lead to higher assessed values. Land is more expensive to acquire, and to develop. That leads to higher assessed values. And finally, people living in these homes, they need a higher household income in order to qualify for a mortgage to buy these homes. So increased revenue from the residents generates more personal property income taxes, generates a higher real estate tax base. They also have disposable income that's being pumped into the economy from going to restaurants and supermarkets and other types of spending. Another factor we found, and this is probably pretty important, bullet, is that fiscal break-even point. The fiscal break-even point, there's a point for every single-family home, townhome, condo, apartment, where the revenues that are generated from the people living in the community will offset the costs to provide public services from police and fire to public schools and whatnot. And at the fiscal break-even point, any value higher than the fiscal break-even point means excess revenues will be generated, a surplus to the county. And if the home is valued below the fiscal break-even point, then generally the cost of providing services to the residents of that home outweighs the revenues that are generated. So we found, contrary to public opinion, fiscal break-even values are curvilinear. Most people think that the fiscal break-even point has to increase every year because the cost of living increases every year. What we found in all the communities we've worked in, it's curvilinear. Some years is up, some years is down. Why is it curvilinear? Because there's other non-population growth factors that affect fiscal break-even points, from tax rates to changes in the level of service that counties and cities and towns provide to residents, to other changes in socioeconomic variables. Also, there's changes between states. The way Maryland treats income tax and sales tax is different than in Virginia. Virginia, for example, I write a check for my income tax, it goes to the state. The state takes that money and redistributes it back to the localities based on the formula. Same with sales tax, so what's different in Maryland. And as we go through different states and we look at this analysis, tax different. In Kansas, sales tax is actually much, much more important, and in Arizona, than real estate tax. And in Arizona, you have many communities where the assessed value of homes are like 10% of the market value because they rely on sales tax as the way to fund the budgets in the local communities. And so fiscal break-even points are curvilinear. Just because at the end of this exercise, when you produce a fiscal break-even point for quality in the county and your committee, that doesn't mean that fiscal break-even point is cast in stone. It could go up next year, it may go down next year. But it's a lot of work, and we're just doing our best to be as thorough as possible. And we don't want to cut any corners, like Anya said. We want to make sure that everything's correct, and so we appreciate your time. And since we're on a tight time frame, I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. So please, I know I spoke rather quickly, and I apologize for that, but any questions you have about what you've seen so far, please ask.
Let's make sure we have time for a couple of questions and then we'll.
Holly, when is our report due?
What do you guys think?
No, our
Friday.
Our report's due Friday. You guys are guessing when is yours gonna come out?
It's not gonna be before.
It's not.
Because what I'm getting at is what,
I think it's March.
I don't remember.
what level of ability are we gonna have to be able to give recommendations if we don't have,
I think at
Their
this
data.
point, the revenue data is relatively solid. The expenditure side is not gonna be ready, before the committee put together the report. So later during the discussion, I guess, we need to discuss, do we need to talk about the Apple? If so, what kind of information we should do? Do you want to talk about now or leave it?
Well, let's make sure we have time
Yeah,
for everybody else.
And I do think for our recommendations, we're really focusing on the next year or two and worrying about the future but not predicting it. Whereas this study, the APFO impacts are really going to be in out years from, our immediate things to say, what should be the next budget, 2 budget cycles.
I'd be looking at this going, let's cut everything. This, but I'm just saying, I'm saying, man, we've got some serious problems coming down the line here. And we got, so anyway, go ahead, I'm just, go ahead.
Any questions just for us? Yes.
I have a question about when you put the data into the model in terms of how many, for example, how many students you're generating per household and type of household, where is that data coming from? Because we found within the county that it's been grossly underestimated, leading to overcrowding, school overcrowding over time. So I hope you're not getting that data from the Office of School Planning, I think the county.
Well, so I provided data, I did the Office of School Planning,
Oh.
and the way that they provide the data, they base their data off of empirical results. So they actually have a standing yield number, so basically an average number for all units across the county, and then they have the yields from new housing, which in often cases is higher. And so the way they determine the yield from new housing is based on housing sales. So any new housing that was built in the last few years, they know where the students reside in the house. So they actually have geocoded points for all of the new students, and they base those yields by school district.
Exactly at the time when the people move in? Well, I
For
mean-
the school year, so let's say there's like this school year, they know where the students live, they can put them on a map, and then if they put them on a house that was built in the last few years, that would be the new housing. That's my understanding of how they do it. And it does vary by geography all across the county, so we actually receive different yield rates for different planning areas, which is what's going to be used in the model.
If I could build up on that, but answer your question from a different perspective. Over the years, when we collect data for any county we're in, there's always an issue about the validity of the data. And if we didn't use county data, and we went out on our own and collected data, then there could be somebody in this committee say, Dean, why did you use outside data and instead of use the data from our own school department, we paid them a lot of money to do this. On the flip side, you say, well, there's instances where you think that data is understated. The only thing we can say is the most reliable source of the data is the individual community, the county, the town, and the city. And, you know, as an outside consultant, I mean, obviously you know your county much better than I do. I don't have the ability to speak about whether the data we get is overstated or understated. So all I can say is that I have to take the stance that the data is reliable, and that I trust that all the departments that we interview are providing us reliable data. Now, we have enrollment data because there's a school census every year, and so I can do a series of back of the envelope checks to kind of say, does this make sense? Is it passive? But at the end of the day, we found that using local county data, whether it's calls for police service or calls for fire department service, or who uses the parks, or how many streets get plowed, or how many kids are in the school system, if I can't trust the individual town or city or county, then
Just
Really quickly add
quick
to that.
clarification.
I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
don't want us to leave here thinking that the data that the school planning provide is inaccurate. That has nothing to do with school construction at all, because school construction is based on empirical data that we have within that area. So the state, if they are going to participate in school construction, wants the actual data that we currently have, not projections.
That's not what the question I'm hearing is we have a number in here that says there's 2.5 students per single family house, 1.5 students per townhome,
Yeah.
whatever that number is. And the question is that, how accurate is that number? But if we look at it on a long run period, it's probably more accurate than it is on a short run period, because, a new community, I think my new community right up the hill, you've got, people move in, they have one kid who registers for school, they got 3 little ones at home that aren't yet in there, and you don't know about them yet.
Nope.
Right.
But that community in the long run probably won't have that many students.
I mean,
So-
that's what I'm getting at. And
Yes,
Yeah.
but that's not a number that the school planning can provide, because it's based on what we currently have.
Right.
And our schools are not
I'm
built
not sure there's a.
to incorporate those 3 students, potential students that we have. The state won't allow it.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
so that was what I wanted to clarify. So when we're looking at these models, you want to take into account that the school system isn't giving data that takes into account babies that are in the womb,
Well,
babies that are too young to
let me
be in
say,
the school system.
so part of their projection model does include an average birth to K ratio. Having said all, so they do try to count. Having said all that, data is not perfect. We all know that. But one of the values of this model is that you can do an assumption, what if we raise the student generation rate by 10%? What happens? So you can do sensitivity analysis. So if there
Which is
is
not something we have the ability to do before.
Right,
That's the real strength of
Right,
it.
right.
It's dynamic.
All right, thank you so much. I think this is great.
Thank
The team I just want to say the team has spent tremendous time, including the snow days, we several on that, and then doing something comprehensive. The reason that we don't have everything is because people want to do it right rather than.
When is the report due?
I have to go back to the contract, but I think it's like March, April time period, and we're doing it as, as quickly as we can.
They're actually not behind. We had already anticipated that this would be.
I was just,
Yeah, but it's always.
it's a curiosity, I can't wait to,
Yeah.
well, maybe not read the whole thing, but I can't wait to get to the tables and understand
We
it.
knew we had this time, but the goal is to get it done before the budget.
Thank you very much. It's very nice meeting everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. So Steve, do you want to start,
Yeah.
continuing the discussion because we
I'm
have
just
to
trying to recover
finish
from
the
the last
recommendation part? Okay.
$1 billion we never had.
Oh yeah, you already have it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so last time, I've got some notes on the revenue forecast and how we're gonna mention that and make sure that we put some discussion around there about the impacts to, what could happen with recession as well as potential for putting some money aside to boost reserves. And then we kind of stopped in the discussion we're having around the bond recommendation, what level of borrowing we thought would be something that this committee wanted to recommend to the county on the bond authorizations for fiscal year 2020. We talked a little bit about, being a little more prescriptive about the, the use of the bonds. I looked again at the request from the county executive of the committee, and more just around the affordability piece of that. Although I think it would make sense in an additional recommendation to talk at some level about the need for the county to come up with a better, cross-agency plan, long-term capital plan, as opposed to each individual area of the county having their own long-term capital plans. Have one that speaks to the actual realities of what we can afford as a community. So just kind of start with that bond recommendation and where everybody is thinking for fiscal year 2020.
So I think I understood, you said we have 211 that is available to the county, but so anything we would put in here would be added on top of that?
So from my understanding, and I don't think anybody from
Yeah.
finances.
That's correct. That was technically correct. However, that 211 was historical authorized. Those not necessarily issued in FY20. It's likely to get spread in the next several years
Tied
because
to
it
other
takes time to have a contract, construction, you spend it, and then issue bond there. So that's going to go into the pipeline. But conceptually, you're right. That 211 are going to be issued in the next few years on that. So that's going to take some capacity on every year how much we can afford on that, which is true. But the 90, whatever the amount that's going to be authorized FY20 also is going to be, not going to be issued that year. It's also going to have a delay as well. But you're right, historical
You're getting an
authorization-
answer that is clear as mud because it is clear as mud.
Well, I guess
I've
where
asked
I'm,
multiple times,
But
is there a chart that says, here's the $230 million that is authorized, what project is it tied to? I haven't seen that.
My concern goes back to given that what we just saw, and that it is scary. I don't know how I could in good conscience tell anybody to add to that. So again, like you were talking about a zero recommendation, that's scary numbers you're talking about there. So I'm trying to, I'm not trying to be alarmist here, but I'm thinking I'm missing something and I'm trying to catch up here.
No, you're not missing. I mean, all else being equal, that's a really scary number. The offset to that is that's based on revenues on rates that are in place today. You cover that gap by either reducing the services you're going to implement, which as we've talked around this table multiple times, we have way more needs on things that we have to do as opposed to things that we want to do as a community that we have to figure out a way to pay for, which is probably the scariest part to the conversation we were having the other day when we talked about the whole impact of property tax values on some of the homes in the community.
Going back to the authorized but unissued bonds, is there any correlation between the years in which bonds were authorized and unissued and the actual projects that they're utilized for at a future date? Is it done in any sequential order or not? Or is there any way of correlating the actual implementation of projects to the year in which those authorized but unissued bonds were approved?
I think the early, when finance did the presentation, is there's a rule of thumb. Usually it takes a few years there to actually go through the pipeline on that. So when they do the cash modeling for the debt service, it's just an assumption based on the average. How long does it take to absorb those authorization there? But again, each project is different, but that's just kind of the general idea. I think it takes like 3 to 5 years to finalize whatever to actually pay the debt service.
I mean, just because, a good portion of the capital budget goes to the school system, what's the typical time from start to finish for a school?
3 years.
So 3 years, and so that's going to be in 3 different authorizations?
No, it's one.
So it's going to be authorized at
Once
one
it's
time when it
authorized, we
starts,
start.
but it's going to be in 3 years of funding,
Yes.
right? So if it's, how much is a elementary school?
Elementary is about under $50 million, maybe 45.
Okay,
The
so
high
40
school is more expensive.
Okay, so 45 million, so you should expect 15 million a year
Yes.
roughly
Mhm.
to build out that school. So in that
Yes.
211 million of authorization, that's over a multi-year period.
Well, you're only getting authorized in multiple years, not just 1 year.
Oh, that's what I was saying.
Oh, okay, I thought you were saying.
Well, that's what I was saying, and then he said, no, it's authorized once.
Right.
No, but it's one time with the capital project, you know the number of years
No,
that the
you've
project is going to be
approved
going
the capital project, but the
You're only
capital
getting
authorizes the
appropriation.
funding in that year,
Right,
each
and then-
year.
Right. And you can finance can give you where all the bond, what projects, the bonds, the prior year bonds are associated with.
But not whether they're still moving forward or not.
Yes.
That was
Oh, that is part
the
of it.
question we asked last year, the year before, and maybe they can now.
It's always been there because the bonds are authorized for 4 years. So if the
Right.
project falls off after the 4th year, you have to go reauthorize it. And by then, there's a determination made. Is this project moving forward? If it's not, then that money is now reauthorized to another project, which is freezing the what you were saying about the 116 and all that.
Right.
We've moved from other projects to new projects.
So, but each year we're approving based on the need, right? So if we have this and we're funding a $45 million school, I'm just still trying to understand, so we're authorizing 45 million this year, or we're authorizing 15 million this year?
15. But you know for the project how much the entire project is going to cost. It has
So
to
we
be
know.
in the capital.
So based on stuff that we already have happening right now, stuff that's already under construction, that we're in the middle of, there is a number that needs to be authorized just to continue to fund those, ignoring starting anything new.
Yes. Yes.
And that number is, do we know that number?
Say that again.
I don't know that I can. No, so we have projects that are currently under construction today that are coming in for their 2nd or 3rd year, and we need authorized funding for those projects for this year.
And
We are-
Okay, this slightly, I don't want to complicate people, but there's 2 different things here. what you just talked is the total project cost versus how much is authorized. And in that case, if the project cost is 45, in reality, it could be spread in 2 or 3 years for authorization. What the time when we actually issue bonded debt service will have another couple of years delay, because when you actually finish the construction and then we use line of credit and then reimburse ourselves, it will be a few more years down the road. That's a time when we're saying what's in the budget versus what actually we pay debt service. You
But in
always have
theory,
that lag.
But in theory, that lag, I'm not thinking about that lag, I'm thinking about the
But
the
that's
lag of-
why you see bond authorized but unissued, is because that natural lag itself is gonna take a
Yeah.
couple more years.
because of the way we fund ourselves.
Right, right. But the other thing is, I want to say, I acknowledge the fiscal prudency, because it's true, I think, if you look at all the things we have been talking so far, the debt capacity versus the needs on that, we are already in big trouble. At the same time, I just want to remind people on that, all those projects already in the capital budget, some are in the design stage, some in the construction stage. If you authorize no new bond, then these are the things they all have to pause. So that's another problem to consider, because a lot of the projects there, we typically have very limited, if anything, new project to authorize, a lot of just existing one. If you want to keep them in pace, or at least continue that, you almost have to authorize
Well,
to
and so,
keep it moving. So
that was kind of where my question is going. I don't want to screw us
Not to
up.
say we can't
I don't
afford
want to screw us
that.
up 3 years down the line because we said 0 now, but do we have that number then? What is required to keep those things moving? If we wanted to say, we want to authorize the minimum available to not cause a complete stop of all
Just to be
these.
clear, we're not authorizing anything, we're only recommending. The council and the
I
county.
guess, we don't have any power, I guess. But I'm getting it.
That's a good question, but I'm not sure there's such
You
a
have to pay for
thing
it.
called the truly minimum, it's a policy decision.
I have a question to follow up. So there are some projects, obviously, in your design phase, you've not really broken any ground, so you could probably stop a project after the design phase is delayed. It's commonly done. The question is what proportion of the projects we started are in the design phase, where if we delay them for a year, because basically, we're broke, how do we then sort of, is that a number? I mean, I'm not saying we go to 0, that might be rather draconian.
I don't know.
But, in a situation in which we face some serious fiscal challenges, and in the absence of anybody raising any taxes, which I don't think anybody has an appetite to do perhaps in their first year as county executive, that might be the second term of county executive an approach, but, what is sort of, so that's a consideration, is sort of, what is our mix of projects that are, that need to be funded? Actually, we've already broken ground, if we stop, all of a sudden we're going to keep building for a year, versus, well, we designed it, maybe we just kind of put it on the shelf a little bit, and then maybe the next year we can come back and see if we, if that's. So
That's where I'm headed.
Right.
What,
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I find it curious that it is so difficult to get an answer to the question of what has been authorized versus what has been issued, and what does it look like moving into the future. Because as we said, if we're going to suggest something, we don't want to suggest something and have someone looking and go, well, that's not going to be possible because of how much we've authorized versus how much is issued and all of that. I think it would be more prudent for us to have the data so that we can look at it and we could
You have the
say,
data. The data, I think what was shown by Nikki the other day, how much to authorize and issue, that's something we're gonna issue that in the next several years. But if you say exact timing for each of the project there, we wouldn't know, because that's depending on actual timing of the projects moving on that.
but I would hope somewhere there would be a list of all of the different projects and
Oh, we
where they
have that.
are within their point
Oh,
in
yeah.
time
Okay.
and how much is left to.
The county has that in other years when we've maybe been less rushed as a committee. One of the things the schools did, especially because they are a larger part of the capital budget, was present the status of each of the major projects. Is that what you're saying? Or are you talking about the bonding associated with those?
I'm talking about the funding associated with it, because there's two things. Because there's obviously a difference between having the bonds authorized versus being issued, correct? Once they can't be issued without having been authorized first, correct?
And
So we would know what the universe is of what has been authorized, correct? And then we would know of the authorized, how many have been issued, what projects are outstanding, and then we could make a recommendation, maybe not necessarily, I don't know if we want to go and say a certain dollar amount, but say enough in order to create a balance that would allow certain projects, because once you start funding a project, you don't want the money to drop off, correct? So there is that.
I mean, depending on the project.
Well, I'm being kind.
But, yeah.
But, you know, there is that balance between, there could be projects on there, for example, that have been authorized that may not, shoot me, see the light of day for a multitude of reasons. So then that number,
Well, that's one that's been reallocated
That has
to,
been-
that's, it's authorized to be reallocated in authorization.
right, exactly.
That actually, in the past couple of years, we did exercise. That's why you see that number drop from $300-some million to only a little more than 200 million. That's almost close to the natural delay between when you authorize and actually you spend and get reimbursement. There might still be a little bit wiggle, but very little now. And every year when we develop budget, we look at which project can be closed and free up $1 million or $2 million or something. Then that actually would kind of free up some capacity there. But at this point, I don't know if it could be that scientific to say, of all the one left there, we know exactly at what point they're going to be spent and get that service on them. There's projection, but these are things are going to keep change.
Yeah, but we know, I'll go back to this, because I understand what you're understanding. So I'm looking at the chart from last week, which shows that total authorized but unissued bonds, GO bonds, $217 million, right? We have other levels of bonds for, tax increment bonds, the P3 bonds, stormwater fee bonds, water and sewer bonds, total authorized but unissued bonds of $760 million. So we've got a lot of authorization out there for a lot of different things. Those other ones have different revenue sources. But to this particular question isn't necessarily about the timing. It's about the county's being asked to authorize a certain level of bonds this year, right, in the capital budget. A portion of that authorization is to fund projects that are currently under construction. How much is that dollar amount? Do we know that? That's the, forget all the other pieces, that's the question. Do we know how much?
I don't have accurate number, but it's going to be more than 90%, I think, existing project.
Okay, so.
I think you usually have very limited new projects.
Okay, but the $232 million request includes a bunch of new projects.
Both new and existing ones.
If we were to do 95 million as planned in the modeling that Nikki was showing us earlier this week, that 95 million, your best guess as to what percentage of that would be for funding projects? Is it 60 million? Is it 70 million? Is it 75 million?
Okay, it's two things related to that. One is that it's going to be dominantly for the project already started. The second part is that if we use historical level 90 to 95 million authorized, that means they're what's in the original plan. Even though some of authorized one, they have to delay from the original hope of planned or requested stage right now. Because currently, there's a plan or wish list there, say these projects going on at this point should be finished next year or whatever. With the funding, even 90 to 90, 50, sounds like, as the group has consensus, may not be affordable. But even you do that, that means a lot on the list there, you have to, originally you plan to finish by this time, you have to delay 3 or more, 4 more years in order even to do the existing project there. That's
That are
already
already
started.
approved.
Yes, it's
Okay.
that bad.
It's that bad.
Yes.
All right, so I'm gonna put $70 million on the table. We could talk about this for another hour. And I think we can craft some language to your point, because it's a continual conversation and it's a need, but I think it goes into that overall long-term capital planning across the county, not just on an agency-specific piece.
And I agree that at some point that it's not just to look at this year. We did mention that before that it's really engage all the stakeholders to look at a little bit more realistic multi-year planning, because if you look at last year's budget, they expect this one to happen by this year, this project to happen by that year, but in reality, the funding is less than 1/3 of that there, plus even that is going to make the county stretch in terms of funding side. So what about the proposed 75 million, is everybody fine?
70 or
70, I'm sorry.
70, so on the low side. Always out there, yeah.
What about that one?
But it's always a recommendation, I mean, obviously.
And we're gonna
past
write it, and
reports-
if everybody doesn't like some of the language, they can come back and say, hey, can you shift this or shift this.
But at the end of the day, the county council goes like, eh. and-
Well, last year was 75
Right.
and the number was 97,
Right, so,
with some reauthorization of previously authorized funds.
the 70, I mean, yeah.
So can we have a vote on 70? All in favor of 70?
I tend to be more conservative, and I agree that we should be looking at a lesser number because we need to keep the importance of that fiscal restraint and responsibility present. Because of the great amount that the school system has in terms of its overall impact on the projections, I think think that way. Oh, and you weren't asking for commentary, you asking for.
I'm just. I can put that in the report tomorrow. So does everybody want to raise their hand?
So 70.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we got 6 and 70, so that's not a majority of this room.
So does anybody else have a different proposal? We can vote on that as well.
I will go for 90. It's for obvious reasons.
I thought you were abstaining on this.
We have one vote for 90.
I didn't vote, I put a proposal there.
I didn't see anybody else.
So let's vote on that 90. How many people on that?
Some of us have to abstain, so that's
Yes,
why.
because you're asking for money.
No, I just put a proposal there. I'm not voting, I'm abstaining, but I'm putting a proposal out there. Since
How many of
70
us are not
people.
Yeah, how many people are actually having a vote?
I was gonna say.
I think all the
What's the voting
committee members-
population?
So to
So,
clarify, I think all the committee members except the staff.
yeah,
Yeah,
Craig,
okay,
Mayor's office, and
I'm not.
I think
yeah, all vote.
you, yeah, no,
I think
if
yeah,
you're,
all-
if you're, yeah, if you're on the committee, absolutely.
Yes, it's very clear. If you're on the committee, you can vote.
Yeah.
I just, since I'm making a case for us, I'll prefer to abstain. I'll let my members vote, the board members vote, because I'm making a case for what we need. They are the board members, so.
So 90 million?
So,
You can vote, yes.
well, what I'm trying to put forward is, the school system's needs are immense, and we have overcrowded schools. We do not have sufficient capacity to have butts in seats. And, you know, if it's kind of, it feels like a begathon to say, yeah, I think we really need to recommend spending. Can we afford it? No, we can't afford any of this. I mean, what we can afford is the zero. However, what we need to be at least recommending to spend enough to meet our needs. And 70 is not even gonna come close to meeting our needs.
I was at 0.
So was I last year, Keith, so was I. I mean,
My job as a parent, let me take some of the heat off you guys at the school system. I brought these children into the world. That was my decision. It is my job as a parent to educate my children. It is not your job. Okay? So rest assured, I give my children to you because I think you do a good job, but more for the socialization part of it. So relax. The other people in the county maybe need to catch up there, but that's where I am. I don't hold you guys to some, and I'm not going to bankrupt an entire county just so we can authorize stuff to keep going at the rate we're going. It is not sustainable. So in order to teach financial education to my children, we have to get this spending under control. I'm sorry, we just have to. So.
Let me offer a commentary again in this context. because of my background in development, I kind of look at things from a broader perspective. What I mean by that in a broader perspective is that I think that almost all school systems approach capital projects and school systems actually totally wrong. I mean that by this standpoint, we find that there tend to be a one-off, what I call one-off construction. There's very little emphasis because of crisis on redundancy being built in from the beginning. For example, we know that there's a certain population growth. Why not have the design for the schools? I'm going to back up for a moment. A couple of meetings ago, we talked about the great disparity in the cost between a couple of schools that potentially could be planned and are needed. But what happens is that there is not the construction done in a way over the long run so you can lower some of the costs by doing it so you can have expansion on the existing new school being planned into the site. Since land is tight, it requires a strategic, innovative approach in terms of what to do. So when the site is acquired and the building is constructed, have the construction take place so that expansion can be easily tied into one strategic part of the building to not have down the road then two massively expensive separate structures. That's the kind of forward thinking for the next 10, 20, and 30 years that most school systems don't get into. So I don't know how to factor that into anyone else's logic, but I'm talking about the long run, exactly as the study showed us here. If you're looking at school construction, we know we have a crisis, we know that we have a limited land of inventory available, we know that there's going to be a much higher cost, we know that already there are huge dollar amounts for the different schools. What about having some kind of group or some kind of assessment? Can the school be built so on the same footprint, but then with an expansion capacity already there for 10 years further down the road so you don't have to go to another
So
site?
basically, I equate that to kind of almost in an economic development perspective. Companies looking at where to put a facility. Company says, we need 30 acres, not because we're going to build 30 acres now, but because we don't want to have to move later. We're going to get more than what we need now, recognizing that we've already acquired the land to expand, but we're only building what we need at the moment.
Right. And let me use a very cheap example. At the early point, this could be the structure of the school. Anytime you tie in the technology into the building, instead of having a new school, build it so that all the points of future need, technology, power, utilities, so that when you go to expand, it's already set so you can add on the same footprint, you lessen probably 10, 20, 30% of the capital cost by structuring so that all the things that you need for cabling and power are already positioned so that it's just a through-wall penetration for development. That's just my way of looking at things as a developer and asking, why don't we do that in school systems?
We are going forward. I can say that now because our school construction, the model you just talked about now, is how they are designing schools. Yes, I agree, it wasn't how we've done it in the past, but all our new construction that is coming forward, that's the model that we're using.
So going back to the dollar amount here, is there a new proposal or you want to vote on that? Because we need to get settled on this is one of the key charges. The committee has to have essentially a majority vote on that.
I mean, it almost seems like we're, stuck in the sense that it's like on the one hand, we're looking at what we can pay for, but yet at the same time, you feel, the feeling is that, I guess the powers that be are going to go with something else just because, that may be what we need, but at the same time, it's also what we've done.
I would argue that, and maybe I took my vote a little bit too early, but I would also argue that one of the reasons why many people move here or want to move here in Howard County is the quality of the schools. So in some sense, basically, if you're investing in the schools a little bit more, it actually might pay off in terms of increased property value, which then translates into increased tax revenue. So
Which it has today.
Yeah, so the balancing act is, in some sense, basically, if we cut short 70 million to 90 million, what will that do? That could actually have a detrimental impact. So,
But can we afford it today?
Yeah,
That's the question, right?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, what you don't want to do is you don't want to disinvest and find yourself then 5 years down the road, like even worse off.
So how much is the debt service increase for the issuance last year was $11 million, right? So let's say it's $10 million for $100 million, or roughly $9 million for $100 million additional debt service, right? So if we wanted to do $100 million, it's going to cost us $9 million. So the $30 million that's already issued, that we expected the revenue growth that we're going to have this year, 11 of it's already gone to take care of debt service. It's, Raul, it's 1 cent on property tax is about $5 million bucks.
Yep.
Right? So it's 2 cents for every $100 million in debt that we want to do, roughly. It's going to take 2 cents in debt service. Or if it's for operating, for every 100 million, it's going to take 2 cents in property tax. So, I mean, right now what we're looking at is we can afford nothing. If we want to do more, then somebody's going to have to do something on the revenue side. Because to your point, there's nothing we can do on the expenditure side. I mean, we can say we want to cut all we want, but we have services we have to provide. And ignore the increased, you know, the budget that was approved, the $90 million increase that was approved in the county. MOE is going to require us to spend, how much is MOE requirement this year?
This year is 11.2.
Okay, so 30 million, 11.2 is already used up with MOE, 11 million is already used up with, I mean, right? So that's the crisis we're moving into.
And we already don't believe that number's accurate. It's gonna be less.
So all I'm putting out there is, we understand we have issues. As we sit here today with the information we have today, this county can't afford unless they change something else to borrow more or to fund more from an operating standpoint.
So, this is my first year on this committee, and, I mean, I'm looking at these numbers, and can someone sort of put into perspective what 80 versus 10 million versus 70 million? What does that really mean in terms of how many projects we're cutting? Because, I mean, you know, between 70 and 90, it's still a lot, right?
The total project requested is 230 something on that. So like this is it's basically, if we do 90 million, we're cutting 60 or 70% of the request. If we do 0, then it's cutting 100%. So that's just kind of give you a sense. So the requested currently, I think, is towards
That's general?
Geo only.
Geo?
Geo only. So
Yeah, we're only talking about
Geo.
Geo.
Right, I thought that, but that number seemed really high, because schools, 90? Something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
91.
Schools are what? What, 90, around 90 million?
Yeah.
90?
Yes,
91 million in plan.
91, yes.
So, Steve, you were on the committee last year. This is my first year as well.
That's correct.
So, I mean, at some point, you guys did see some of this kind of falling off the cliff last.
Yeah, I voted for 0.
Okay,
I was the 1-0.
okay.
The idea behind it last year was, we knew we had to put a number out there because that's the requirement of the charge of the committee. But we wanted to make sure that the county executive and the county council understood as they looked at things, we were trying to talk about, look what's coming, right? We've been in an expansion for how long? 11 years. 10 years, and we've seen basically growth that's as anemic as we've ever seen during that period of time. And so we haven't seen the budgets grow significantly. We had a couple of off years where it went higher because of pass-through payments and stuff like that. So we've just been doing this. The last time we had a property tax increase in the county was in 2006, 5, 6. We didn't even talk, we just have to do a fire tax increase, right? That's going to happen. There's already 5 cents going to happen.
Well, and to your point about last year, I think we went part of the 75, and even with, I think it was mentioned earlier, I think when Barbara was talking about it, that was also even tied into the external presentations, because part of it was, you know, Steve Sachs kind of almost, who was the chair, was almost kind of, hey, you know, we got to get out and start blowing the horn that, hey, you know, fire's coming, you know, kind of deal. And 75 was more so almost messaging, you know, recognizing that truthfully that number was probably going to be higher, but for this group and part of it, and if we're making recommendations, much like we're talking about now, then it was like, look, recommend less, more so from a message sending perspective of we can't continue to spend the same way we spend.
Without changing something else.
Right.
And I think that's what you're saying is something's got to change. But right now, it's not one of, I mean, we can talk about that in the additional recommendations, but in the, where we are now, it's what it is.
You can talk about it with this, correct? I mean, you could say, this is what I recommend, whatever the magic number we land on. But we could say, look, the challenge we have is that unless we do something on the revenue side, it is not going to work.
I'm reminded, as my board says, sometimes you can't cut your way to profitability, or you can't cut your way to growth. That at some point, you gotta go to the top line.
But then the question is, how do you do this? Did you do it in one fell swoop? Do you do it incrementally? Do you figure out a way to take care of those things?
But we don't have to tell them that. That is what the county executive.
That's what they need to figure out.
That's why they get the big bucks.
But we can't just, we can talk around the issue, but we have to say something, right? So I'm just trying to get us to something so we can at least start to talk around the issue.
Well, one of the things I thought about, and I don't know if it's available, is what, you know, we talked about income is capped, so we can't go to income tax because we're capped off the state level. So we have a pool of tools that we can use to try and get these numbers right, that's gonna work. Some of it is obviously we could cut stuff, or we could raise taxes, I believe. What is at our disposal? So, for example, the transfer tax has a bunch of different components to it.
We'll go over those tours there.
And I agree we do have, but just so you know, we have what's the total budget, $1 billion?
Billion one.
Okay, and how much do we actually have discretion on?
But that's, you know, so.
No, I mean, so you say we can cut,
But then I don't.
$5 million that can be cut from
But
somewhere
that's
else?
what I'm
I mean,
getting, so what is it that we what is it that we actually have ability to do?
There are different things actually listed here later.
Yeah.
Probably need to talk about now, almost like
But-
let's wrap up on the bond and then we can talk about those different potential points if the committee wants to discuss or include in some manner in the report. But I would wrap up on the bond. It looks like the my take is most people appears to be, whoever here is leaning towards 70 million, but with narratives talk about other issues there related on that. And also, I know Barbara is not here today, but she did tell me earlier she was also for it. Sounds like that. Do you need to vote again?
You're the chair. If you need a vote, we'll vote again.
Can we vote again for the 7, it's basically a motion of 70 million, but then put some narrative will address the different points people raised earlier in how we realistic needs as well, and the other points that we need. Can I clarify something real quick?
You got a question? Oh.
Can I just count first? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay, go ahead.
And this is my first year on the committee too, so I'm sorry if it's a silly question, but the 211 million that we talked about earlier, is that hypothetically, is that spread over a few, I mean, it was mentioned that that's going to be available
Yes.
within the next few years. Is it hypothetically over the next 3 years, and it's going to be like 70 million a year, or?
Yes, it's roughly likely to be catastrophic in the next 15 times.
So hypothetically, 70 million in 2020, 70 million in, or is it?
There's a
We don't-
formula in the earlier slides.
Okay.
I will later email you, but it's an early.
Sorry, I tried to find it. but-
Sorry, I don't
Yeah,
remember.
last year they issued 120 million, or I guess that's what you're going to issue this year, based on the offer, the 120 million. Okay, so on the impact on future budgets, which is our third thing, revenue growth from what Holly and Coach presented was somewhere between 2.7 and 2.9%. I think over the short term, that's, from what we've seen, is probably accurate. But based on what we saw tonight, there needs to be some pretty strong language around the impact that it will have in the out years related to the APCO legislation passed last year. And have to bring that in. Does anybody have any disagreement on the 2.7, 2.9? What years are we presenting to? Holly?
It's basically,
The next 3 years?
yeah, next 5 years beyond FY20.
So then my recommendation would be that we say, we see the somewhere between 2.7 and 2.9% over the next 2 fiscal 21 and 22, but for 23, 24, 25 is where we start to see the impact of APCO dropping us below 2%.
So the one question is, I guess, for the committee is we can recommend 2 different scenarios, say with and without Apple, or we
Well,
say
to be
assuming
clear,
Apple.
APCO was approved.
Correct.
Right,
that's
so
true.
this happened,
Okay.
unless there's
That-
some
that's-
legislation, and again, I'm back to the all else being equal, right? This is where we are. I think we need to put that in there, that we see the 2.7 to 2.9 over the next couple of years, but then dropping 2 years
Given dropping
to below 2%.
because the impact of a recession in the next year or two or a slowdown.
Plus APCO.
Plus APCO is going to start hitting us 3 to 5 years out.
Yeah, so we're showing essentially the modified, because earlier I showed everybody doing the Apple presentation, there's one that was before Apple and after Apple, so we're gonna use the after Apple version, because that's, as you said correctly, that's the legislation already passed on that, so we should assume that there, unless anything changes.
Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like a reasonable amount. Okay, so other findings or recommendations, I just wrote some things down here from the conversation that the smaller report writing group had the other day. One was expense controls, one was additional revenue measures, fire tax increase, ambulance fee, transfer tax increase, and reallocation of proceeds. So Keith, you were talking about school and road excise taxes. Sounds like there is a school excise tax in legislation right now in Annapolis for an increase.
Yeah,
Yes.
tonight they're voting on them, I think.
They're voting on it tonight
Right.
to take it up a few dollars.
I think so, yeah, I don't know the specifics.
And then other constraints such as the current tax burden as compared to the other jurisdictions that surround us. And then additional recommendations around building the fund balance, APFO, and preparing for that. And then one of the things that was in the transition report to the county executive was around spending affordability being an annual, being a year-long committee rather than a short 6-week committee, which would allow it to have some more conversations and maybe some more in-depth understanding and better recommendations. And so we were talking, maybe that should be in a recommendation that we also put into the report.
Just so you know, the discussion on impact fees was tabled until February 27th.
Okay.
Quick question, does anyone have an idea what the gross, for example, ambulance might be in terms of an actual dollar number that would be expected to be generated?
It was in the presentation.
I think it's roughly, for the school surcharge fund there, the current collection is roughly $7 million, so if we base the fee as the delegation was proposed, I think add another 14 million-ish.
No, he's talking about the ambulance.
Oh, ambulance. Raul, do you have the most updated?
It was about 3 million.
Annually?
Yep,
Net.
yes, net. So
Is that
that's-
going to the fire fund?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure. My first question answered.
So, yeah. And that's the only
And
one we
then
had.
we put in the last few years this recommendation to increase the transfer tax by 20%, but also to look at reallocating the proceeds because of where the needs are in the community. We're getting to the point where a portion of the transfer tax was related to preservation, and we're getting full on what the plan was for preservation. So could those dollars, once that's done, be shifted to school construction or something else?
I have another question. This is kind of in the vein of additional revenue measure, but perceptions also matter in terms of the appearance of doing all you can for fiscal responsibility, et cetera. So I'm gonna ask a couple of questions to formulate the thought that I want to throw out. Right now, how many actual schools do we have in Howard County right now, total number of schools?
77.
77. Where I'm headed with this is, and I'm just gonna throw this out, so bear with me for a moment. A year or so ago, well, actually 3 years ago, part of the Green Initiative, we generated a revenue stream on a project where we actually utilized the roof surface in a nonprofit in Washington D.C. where I installed a green solar system where they get thousands of dollars per month. My concept that I'm thinking here is that if we're going to be an innovative county, as we say the technology and all that is such a big factor, with 77 schools with some average square footage per school, well, all of that rolling into some large numbers, probably if on an acreage basis, if one was to convert it, would be probably 6 or 7 acres worth of surface area that could easily be converted into generation of solar energy, so at least we could have a line item for green energy to at least show and have that contribution coming back, because when you compile all that together, it could be worth a number of jobs, it could be worth a number of school supplement resources being available. And when you spread 77 schools into a compilation, if one entity that only had 5,000 square feet of space, just using this as an example, in Washington generates $3,800 a month, and you have 77 schools with probably 10,000 to 15,000 square feet of whatever that average square footage, at least as a county and as the initiative that we could show showing fiscal responsibility and every available resource not going unused, it might be worth at least exploring the innovation of utilizing all of the schools' roof surfaces for a green space, solar energy specifically, for a revenue line. It might be worth a couple of million a year. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just throwing that out for those of us in the committee to consider that that might be a line item that could be narrated, at least in the report when we write it, to consider that as another line item. Just throwing it out for something to consider. And if it generates enough for additional resources for employment, if it generates enough revenue for something else, I don't know what that number would be, but a study certainly might be worth finding out what 77 school services combined might generate.
Well, but if you could go beyond the school, or the county has a lot of different schools, so it could be a general comment around.
We've actually done one green school where we use solar energy, so it's zero energy, zero cost. We have one. I'll have to check with our engineers to see if that is still in the work. So I have not gotten the information about the reason we are not looking at it in our next project, because it's
expensive.
Yes.
It was going to be an extra like $8 or $9, $10 million to build the school itself. So it was a huge break-even point.
The actual need for some kind of assessment to make sure, because what's happening annually, the cost for installation we're finding continues to change so dramatically, and with the also federal support, and it varies by administration, but for those kinds of things, there are credits and other things that might make it worth at least doing a study so that question is answered.
I think that's a good point. Maybe we just kind of like, as a committee, make one point like about encouraging the study or use the green building potential savings on that. For the other boards here, do we need to dive into a little bit on that to make sure we know as we're writing a report what exactly?
Does anybody have any other suggestions for additional expense controls or revenue measures, or have an issue with anything that's written on here?
Can I suggest another sort of narrative or something that we asked moving forward? I think the point was made about investment, making the investment into the schools. We continue to be a destination county for schools. That's why people move to Howard County. And we have great police and everything else, but contemporary music in schools. So I think what we need to do is, because of where we are with revenues versus what we need to spend on, is that there has to be a discussion between the school system and the county and the community as to what should education look like in Howard County moving forward. Because it is going to change. I don't think that surprises everybody. But I think that conversation needs to start to happen with our, speaking of the school system board member, with our other elected officials and with the stakeholders, because we cannot continue to be the way we are.
So let me reframe it, so you're suggesting have some narrative to say there needs to be more communication there between the school system and all the elected officials in the government. More productive conversation.
We have to think about, because we have needs, the students, you know, I mean, that's the issue that we have with development with students. If a student shows up at the door, we can't say, we don't have a seat for you. We have to educate that student. So no matter what, because people say, well, why don't you go to more schools? I'm like, well, we don't create revenue. You know what I'm saying? We have to come to the county provides the money, yet the kids keep coming. So we're kind of doing catch-up. And we do recognize that there are other needs within the county. So again, it goes back to that balance as a county as a whole. We want to provide the best education for each individual student, and that is going to vary by student, depending on their needs. And it goes back to the demographics issue. The demographics are changing in the county, which also means the demographics are changing of the students who are coming, and they have more need than the students did 10 or 15 years ago. And we need to provide services to meet those needs. And if, depending on how our funding is, then we have to take it from somewhere else.
I have another quasi-narrative piece, and it kind of relates to what you were saying the other day about that we're here and we've heard what everyone's needs are, but we're not putting any emphasis on priority. But in terms of where we're making recommendations for spending, we kind of do need to have some sense of a priority of where we think the spending is going to be most effective. And to that end, I'm going to again lobby back towards the schools, because the schools are the driver as a destination county for people settling here. And so I would hope that in our narrative we can reflect how critical it is to spend wisely, but as well as spend effectively, since this is where we will end up generating further revenue in the future.
Phrase in a way, make it a little more comprehensive, because first of all, currently the school, not only school, the education entities already take 64%, and once we add that percentage, it's 75% of the county was already just concentrated on education and that service, but all other services, they only take 20-some percentage on that. So the issue is, I'm not against saying that highlight that we need to continue to support a high priority, but I'm not sure we can do prescriptive say that percentage need to be, 64% even higher, than the rest of the county be even smaller. I don't know whether the committee is ready to.
Well, I'm not saying that it needs to be.
So how to prioritize?
But you can have rank order priorities without it being numerically quantifiable. Like, we recognize, I mean, it can be simply, we recognize the value of excellent education as an economic driver, and continuing to fund it effectively is a priority.
What I'm hearing is not that she's saying that it needs to increase in percentage, but that it needs to continue at a similar level to maintain that attractiveness for people to continue to move. Unless I'm hearing you.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so, and I hear what you're saying, and I think that I would go back to the point that really what needs to happen, which isn't happening, isn't to talk about, I got my education and Anne Arundel County's in the plan. To talk about that the schools need to continue to be a priority, but it's more to have a broad community conversation to say what needs to be the priority. And if it's schools, then great, it's schools. If it's public safety, then it's public safety. But that's the conversation that's not happening, and that conversation needs to happen.
Well,
I like that broad approach.
And I was just going to add, I mean, I think definitely the priority conversation, and then the other thing that I've wondered, and I guess I use the automobile as the analogy. And so, for instance, also when we're talking about, as an example, if an average elementary school is 45 million, then the question that I say is, okay, is that a Honda Accord elementary school, or is that a Mercedes-Benz elementary school? With the thought being that we might want the Benz But a Honda Accord will get us where we need to go in just as much comfort as the Benz, and at least, you know, it saves us, again, in the car analogy, $20,000. I mean, so what are we, when we build a $45 million school, what are we building? And I think part of also that conversation might have to be, hey, we've been accustomed to this lifestyle, but maybe we need to get used to, that we can be comfortable, but maybe we're not, I don't know, maybe extravagant, or we're not in, whatever it is, but that's one of the questions that I guess that I continue when I hear these prices on schools, that I just keep coming back to, like, what kind of school, because is there any way that number, just as an example, is a little bit less? Same thing on the priority piece. If it's education, it's education. I mean, that's nothing wrong with saying, okay, as an example, maybe we spend with the debt service 74 million, not 74% of our budget on education. But if we need this, if the community says we want it to be 80, okay, well then we gotta recognize that means that maybe all our parks may not have the nice turf fields, that they have grass like we grew up. I mean, I'm just saying something.
You had grass?
Something.
They were fancy.
Something may just have to, again, check that you can't have top-notch, I mean, everything can't be, you know.
Yeah, but we're paying, in this community, we're paying the third highest tax rates of any jurisdictions around us. So if we're paying that high, the demands from the community are, we should be getting what we're paying for, right?
But for me, since I've been here, it's always been what we're paying for is education. I mean, I don't mean in a negative sense, but when I first got here, I'm sure this is what you heard when you interviewed. Everything I heard was about, oh, do you have kids? Yes. How old are they? Oh, Howard County has great schools. I mean, that was the first, literally, conversation when I said how old my kids were. And so, again, I mean, I just think that if that's the bell cow, then that's where we've got to adjust.
But we have a demographic in this community that's growing that doesn't have children.
Right.
So what are their needs? How do we, so it's a bigger, broader conversation than to say one or the other. And we're talking around the issue. And so if we can at least say something in here, hey guys, time out. You've got to have a bigger, broader.
Well, yeah, I mean, our whole discussion is around the expense side. The top line is really about, do we need to increase revenues across the board to afford our expectations? I mean, people come to Howard County, they spend $500,000 plus on a home, they expect good education, they expect parks with real turf, they expect to be able to have soccer from 10 o'clock at night till 2 in the morning with well-lit fields. They expect the most greenest things in the roofs, all the stuff, all the amenities. But when it comes to raising taxes, people say, "Whoa, you can't raise taxes. That's crazy talk." But at the end of the day, we look at the numbers, we see everything is all the expenditures are rising, and then we consider a new school. All we're considering is the construction cost. We haven't talked about the operating expenses or the maintenance expenses or everything else that goes on with running a.
Yeah, the $70 million, that's it's cheaper to buy the boat than it is to take care of it. So
I think at the end of the day, either in the report itself is considerations about the top line number versus just talking about the expenditures. You said the discretionary we can cut is such a sliver that it would make a hill of beans difference. They just say it would slow the leak essentially, because essentially we're going to have a leak.
So if we, as a community, we don't have the stomach to do that, right? Somebody said, why would you do it in the first year? So if we don't have the stomach to do it, then we have to prioritize and say, this is what we can do now, and then have a plan for what we can do later.
Well, the question becomes, are we managing expectations?
Does it look like expectations are being managed? I mean, funny, does it look like expectations are being managed? I mean, look at the request we see. I mean, your request for 232, it's like, okay, we got to get it in, because if we don't get it in, then we never have a shot.
So this is very good discussion. I think a lot of this can be incorporated in the report, because a lot of reflect the true issues, but also what I hear is collectively suggest the government to work with all the stakeholders and dialogue with the community, understand the kind of like dilemma on that there, and try to get a sense about, because there's all kinds kinds of hard choices on that, and then what will be the ideal mix of those solutions
I
that
think
all
they were-
have consequences.
Yeah, I think the recommendation needs to be stronger than, we think they should do this. I think it needs to be, we believe they should set up a blah, blah, blah to do this. You know, not just a soft, hey, let's go figure it out.
I guess I've got a question. I guess what I'm trying to reconcile is if there's $230 million worth of requests, and we're talking about a 70 million, 80 million, 90 million, I'm not sure where all these numbers came from, we just kind of picked them. But, I mean, education clearly is Howard County's pinnacle piece. I mean, it's what we spend most of our money on. It's clearly more than half of the overall request for this year out of the budget that's coming in. And if you, I don't know, I run my own company. If my guys came to me and said, okay, well, we recommend a $70 million or $80 million bond, and then they hand me a piece of paper and say, I got $232 million worth of expenses I want you to pay out of that, I'm like, well, now I'm back at square one. I've got to figure this out unless there's some other recommendations that's coming down the pipe with it, because they were the ones that sat through all the presentations of all the agencies, and if I don't get anything else other than $70 million to pay for $230 million, I'm back at square one without the benefit of even hearing any of the presentations.
So the 230 million is the request. The 70, the 90, whatever the number is what we can afford. So the decision isn't, I have to figure out how to pay for 230 million. It's, of the 230 million, what do I say I can do and what do I say I can't do?
But are we providing some form of recommendations with regards to what we feel the priorities are and where we direct this based on the fact that we were the ones that sat through all the presentations?
I didn't get elected, so I'm not willing to say this is what you, the people who got elected can figure out what
Well, I'm not
priorities
saying
are.
specifically, but I'm just kind of saying priorities, like what Jen said, the priorities is education, there's some real needs at the public safety level, at corrections. Or
Yeah, I think that's what we'll say in the section about the requests are, hey, you have a lot of needs coming from the community, you have to weigh what those priorities are, and then we're going to add into that, and we believe you need to have a bigger conversation about priorities. But I don't, maybe the committee feels differently, but I'm not prepared to say, I think you should spend of the 70 or 80 or whatever the number is, what did we say, 70? That we should put 50 million into schools and 10 million into this and 5 million into that. But the charge was, what can we afford?
I don't think we can say put 50 million, 10 million, so here, but I don't, and you correct me if I'm wrong, this is my first go round on this. Is there something wrong with saying that, you know, there were some need, and I'm just taking this out of thin air, I don't have the manager of the Parks and Recs or whoever outside waiting for me, but is there not a reason to kind of say, hey, you know, the baseball field, although you guys moved to Howard County because you want to perk the turf and all the rest of that stuff, is a little less important than the prison doors popping open. Or trying to identify, you know, giving some guidance to priorities that public safety, you know, better EMS response times may be a little bit more important than, I don't know, football court, volleyball court, or something like that. I don't know. But just kind of giving it some form of prioritization without being very specific about, like you said, 70 million and 30 goes here and 20 goes there and 10 goes there. Because we heard a whole lot of agencies come through here and they all have a multitude of needs, and I just...
They're all, just to be clear, they'll hear all those agencies as well.
I'm sorry?
They will also hear those agencies. We're not the only ones who are hearing.
Oh, I thought we were the ones that heard these agencies. So they're gonna go pitch to them as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the biggest. So that's the one in the state. What's the one here?
Megathon 2.0.
So they're gonna get the same presentations for the requests.
Good luck with that.
I think we could all say, we would like the prison doors not to process.
Yeah, I think I'm right there.
Well, and I would say for those of us that have been here longer than 1 year, the prison conversation has been happening at least 2 to 3 years. And just the same way, the courthouse presentation was probably 4 years. And, you know, I say it all the time, you know, and I say it tongue in cheek, but with some seriousness, we've just been fortunate that we've got good criminals. I mean, and and I said that tongue in cheek, but and I look at it, when I heard last year, I guess last year was maybe it took a minute to catch it. But when I'm just listening to some of the deficiencies that was expressed in the courthouse, and I'm sitting here thinking, we've just been really fortunate that we have not had some type of catastrophe when you really looked at it in terms of whether it was how people are escorted in, where they're held. I mean, or maybe someone had a verdict that they didn't like, but they went back and charged it to the fact that I didn't have good counsel because we couldn't go into a confidential place. I mean, all kind of stuff that I'm hearing that ultimately leads to either lives lost or money spent because of the fact that we kind of pushed things off because we said, well, you know what, courthouse, again, maybe relative to whatever else wasn't as important, knowing that, yes, it's a huge dollar spend. But it just kept coming back to me that, like, we're rolling the dice on some of this stuff. And again, if we continue, when you hear the jail conversation as well, it's like, okay, well, how long do we kind of roll the dice? Going back to your point, maybe it's a case where, again, we're not putting the dollar, but some things do have to get a little bit more attention, even if we don't say do it, but hey, you know what? Not that you want to look, but you really need to look at this. This is like really serious over here. I mean, like really, really serious. To where at least it's emphasized that amongst some of the top areas that this is serious because, again, you're talking, you start looking at lawsuits and other things that can come about because of perhaps some negligence that you knew about and you just, for whatever reason, good, bad, or the other, didn't address.
That's a good point.
So the rest of the list there, are people comfortable with putting that or add something? Like design we discussed?
Do you agree on the transfer tax language or something similar from last year, or?
It's on the list. I haven't heard anything from anybody on the transfer tax. I haven't heard anything from anybody about any other looking for additional revenue sources.
Well, so one thing, with the transfer tax, I didn't see a breakdown. The last 2 years, this has come up at the state, and we've gone down to testify. So this was based off of the projection from last year, so not this report that the gentleman from Lake here talking about tonight. So I don't have those numbers, but the projection was that the Ag Preservation Fund was going to get nearly upside down somewhere in that belly of ADFO. And that is just paying for land that has already been put into preservation. So that is paying back folks that are in, not taking on any new. Right now, the county, Allen had put a moratorium on any new properties coming in. My understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, was also that the fire company, that portion would struggle. I didn't see anything giving those estimates, so as far as making a recommendation as to what to increase it, yes, I mean, if we're going to do something in order to make sure that stuff can continue, we need to increase it. But I don't know what to recommend because I'm not sure what level would be appropriate.
So you're basically saying the concept, not necessarily the detail and
Well, like I said, I would feel uncomfortable saying raise it a quarter because I don't know are we still in that shortfall scenario that was given last year with this new, hopefully better model. But I don't know that. So that's
what we could do is just put language in there around all the fees and taxes that the county needs to do an analysis of them to see if there's any room for.
Yeah, because one of the things that
look at our recordation taxes.
The deputy chief said, there was something that had over time it used to be funded out of the general fund or whatever their normal budget was, but it slowly was thrown over into, let this transfer tax take care of it, which now what that pool of money is supposed to take care of has swelled. And so they're actually doing more of their budget from that tax than what they used to, and that's causing some problem. So some of it may be that, saying, because like, the Ag Pres Soil Conservation District gets 80% of their budget out of Ag Pres. So we gotta be careful where all this stuff interconnects with.
So a couple of things. One is that sounds like the one proposal was, which was just raised, is that maybe have a more generic study of fee and the tax on that. But under that, we can maybe add a couple examples, but without going to the details about the level of fee, rate, etc.
Yeah, because if you look at the total fees in the presentation that was done.
Yeah, about tax burden and tax options.
Yeah, you had the one you presented, it was.
It was the one that we're not.
We're like the lowest of any of the surrounding counties on recordation tax.
Yeah,
Right.
those transfer under position.
I mean, significantly lower than Montgomery County and Baltimore County, well, we're saying Baltimore County. But that could be an area where it's an ability to increase some additional revenue without changing the burden.
Right, it's at 250, and
Yeah.
on average, when you compare the counties, it's looking closer to like $4 in surrounding counties.
Yeah, and they were all closer to 250, so it looks like in the last few years they've raised as
Yeah.
well.
So, I mean, I don't see that in the report considerations. Is that something we can add?
And
I
would
mean, it
definitely
seems like
agree with that.
something easy just to catch up with the other counties, like it just,
Keep in mind though, our average sales price in Howard County is much higher than some of the surrounding counties as well though too. So that's the only thing I would consider from the standpoint of still attracting new families to come into Howard County, and schools are definitely a driver, but.
Do you pay a recordation tax when you pay a transfer tax? You do?
But I do think that I appreciate the point that she's making, but I think that when you do a comparison, the beneficial values of Howard County will greatly outweigh, I believe, the negative impact of raising it because of so extensive the things, education and otherwise, to make Howard County attractive, especially in light of the fact that so many of the adjacent counties are already higher. It just leaves us in a position where right now, I don't think we're picking up a great risk that there would be a decrease in the transitions to the county because of that broad array of what makes Howard County so attractive. Not disagreeing with what you're saying.
It's an easier thing to stomach than a few cents more on property tax. Because that's, this is a one time as opposed to long term. But we're sitting here talking about two taxes that will be negatively impacted with development of capital.
So let me ask you a question. So talking about the recordation tax that we just now having a dialogue, is that something that we need to discuss, making an actual recommendation for an increase or not, and have a vote or not?
Well, I have to make sure that there's two, there's a transfer and recordation, so we're.
I'm trying to be very specific about the recordation because.
And that's what I'm saying, so, make sure we're.
So I think the question is.
My recommendation would be to put it in there as a potential source of revenue, not necessarily to say we think it should increase to $3.50. But if the committee wants to vote on something, it's the committee's vote.
well, I mean, I would include language that says that it should be increased to match, but, be closer to surrounding counties. I don't see that we don't have to come up with a number, but they can easily extrapolate that from the data. And we don't have to give a specific number, that's their.
Yeah, if you put a specific number, then you're probably going to have to put the number in, it's going to result as well, what the revenue is going to produce, again, calculate that.
And we don't have that.
Right, without the.
You're better off just putting a
With
general.
the transfer tax, we had it, because we were able to say, if we did this, it's probably going to generate this, which means it could be leveraged into this.
Just a quick question on that, just for, I guess maybe my clarity. When we talk about compared to the other counties, and I'm just noticing here as an example, when you look at, like I'm seeing, for instance, with Howard at the end, when we talk about the, never mind, that's something, well, I'll still raise it. I guess my question, while the recordation number may be lower, but then when you go over to the far right as an example, and you start looking at impact and excise tax, and you see some, I guess, are doing it square foot. I don't know what the other ones, when I see, like, for instance, with Anne Arundel, when it says 8,196, or Calvert at 12,950. I don't know if that's a flat number or what have you, but ultimately my question being, is it a case that are we actually really less? However, when you factor in other things because we may be calculating it differently, does it end up being the same, that if one is using a square foot and one is using a higher fee, you know, are we still less, or is it a case that we just go about ours differently compared to the other counties? And I'm just asking that before we say that we're less.
Some of the ones are harder to compare, is the example we just raised on the school surcharge and excise tax on that. But if we try to make it apples to apples, it's not gonna be exactly. And I think it's still fair to say with the quick study on that is that I think we are lower than most others on it, for at least for the so-called impact on that.
So
I
I'll just,
understand that our house value is higher, but that part in general, I think is still very stable.
yeah, so I'll just add, so the numbers that are there that are numbers that you said that are flat numbers, that's just an average of the total of what they charge, because they charge on a per square foot. Anyway, so like a house that's, or a dwelling or development that's 500 square feet is gonna pay X amount. If it's 1,000, it's gonna pay X amount. It's just flat that way. But what you see there is an average of what they charge overall. And like Holly was saying, when we're trying to compare a 500-foot dwelling in each county, we're still the lowest. So, and when I did that, well, for example, like a 500-foot dwelling here is about $1,000 or like $1,600. In Anne Arundel County, you're talking about $4,700. So there is a huge disparity in that.
So for the revenue side, I think it sounds like there is a general kind of collective consensus about what we can discuss on that, and in to what level on that. And mostly it was try to see compared to other areas, whether that does room, so it makes at least more comparable rather than higher than everybody else on that. There's one just quick piece of information to share with you on the transfer tax here. Here's how both tax increase and reallocation proceeds. When there's a doable is historically, as you exactly mentioned earlier about, there's one time that ag land appears to be down the road have some flexibility of fund balance on that, and that was changed based on an actual amendment, because at one point last year actually it was predicted to be in deficit. With the updated information that including some one-time money we got last year, that fund actually looks like it's like a better position now. So we're still looking at the model, but I think it's still valid to say down the road there might be some opportunity. May not be next year at some point. Certain rates could be. It may not be F-line, could be other ones. They might be flexible to allow shifting on that. So as a generic note, I think it's probably can still keep it there. The other point I think the committee in the past mentioned that is whether to transfer ask for transfer authority from the state to local governments. Currently, state legislation drive that. So if people are comfortable, also keep that.
Yeah, I was just saying, Anne Arundel County, it's not designated to ag prayers or school construction or whatever. It's just general fund revenue. This comes in, and it's a pretty nice chunk of revenue they get for.
So yeah, so basically I think it was, the point is that if local government has the elected official has a way to determine which way to go rather than the state legislation kind of determine.
Well, I mean, to talk particularly from the ag side of it, the reason why Montgomery County doesn't have any ag preservation going on right now is because they've all decided that they don't want to fund it, and they haven't been funded. And so the reason why we're doing so good in Howard County is because it's been protected, because it has to go through the state to get changed. So, you know, my opinion would be keep the county's hands out of it. But, you know, again, that's just my opinion.
To keep the county's hands out of their own money.
Yes. Because all the talks about school and education doesn't mean crap if you can't feed yourself. So just keep that in mind.
So one more thing here is there's about Apple. We just heard about it again. Looks our revenue almost get finished on that there, which gives a lot of good information, but expenditure is not finished. So even they said, based on their experience with other counties, you really need to go more than pay for itself there. But for this specific study, there's no conclusion yet there. So the question is, with Apple, shall we just acknowledge where we have conflict? Does the committee want to say a little bit something, or try not to say anything? So that's all the discussion.
I I thought we were gonna talk about it in the impact on future budgets. I don't think we put it anywhere else, and we're talking about it
Oh,
there.
you have a future budget, right,
Yeah.
right, that's good.
I don't know, there's any
That's
additional
future
recommendations
years.
for it.
Because I don't know that, like you said, that's the law of the land right now, so
Yeah.
there's no point.
The only recommendation last year was, we don't know what the impact was gonna be on
And you
on the
study
fiscal,
that.
so we needed a study. Well, now we're getting a picture.
So there's no point in saying, well, with APFO and without APFO, APFO's there, so just do it. And from a political standpoint, since Calvin voted for it, and now he's the exec, I wouldn't want that in there. I'm just saying, just put it flat, here's what it is, no with APFO, without APFO. Don't draw attention to it.
So any further discussion, and we can put on time?
I don't know about everybody else, I'm kind of winding down.
Quick question. So on the revenue side, we're going to make a suggestion that they look at existing revenue sources. Are we making a suggestion that thinking outside of the box and looking, because what's gonna drive this is the revenue side?
I think we can add a bullet on that there, but unless people have specific example where keep it just kind of a.
No, and I mean,
When
in
you
general,
say,
saying
what's your outside the box?
What's outside the box?
Well, I mean, looking at what do other jurisdictions, I mean, trust me, I hate taxes, but I mean, you have to, if we don't bring the revenue in and expenses, it's going up, what are we gonna do? And if everybody is looking and saying, okay, well, we can't do any more on impact fees, or we can't do it here, we can't do it here, then so what do we all do? Just stand around and go, okay, well, we can't do it? I mean, this goes back to that conversation that I think needs to happen, is to, if we want a certain level in Howard County, then how are we going to pay? It goes back to how are we going to pay for it?
Well, Christina, I don't know if this is appropriate, and that's why I haven't brought it up, but like, your farmers in the county, we could probably wipe out hunger in the county in 5 years, if you let us. Does that play a part in any of this report? Is there any discussion of, and I don't want to make anybody depressed, but climate change? The predictions are right now, if the water level rises to even half of what they're talking about, we're going to lose most of the eastern shore and all the food production that goes with it. So again, I go back to, it's all fun and games until, I've been in countries where there's famine, and it's not pretty at all, and all this education stuff goes out the window when people can't eat or drink water, So, I mean, at what point, what level, what report, what county agency is actually doing, talking about any of this stuff, because it's important.
So
I don't know, I'm asking.
I don't think it's this report.
Okay, but that's fine.
But it's something that probably needs to be talked about and planned for, and probably something you should reach out to the executive.
All right.
But to your point, I think we need to put in there that, and maybe it can be around what we talked about, just kind of on a base level. Revenues are growing at this rate, expenditures are growing at this rate. I think that one slide that shows that big gap that could happen if we don't figure this out. So we either have to pull back on the expenditures, increase the revenue, do something, but we can't just let it be out there. It's not gonna be one or the other, it's gonna be a combination of both.
Well, actually, I wasn't, but I guess I was, part of my comment, and this is not so much on the question, but just thinking also with what you were just saying, to the best that we can, doing some of this graphically, because that will speak more than people having a bunch of words, but to actually see.
They will be beautiful words.
Angels will sing.
I agree with you. That's what I go to.
That's really good. So I think, I'm not going to vote on every bullet. We're basically saying that we assume everybody in general is fine to mention that on that, and we'll delegate that to kind of small group of volunteers.
When are we going to send it out to the whole group?
Then we will send it back to the
Tuesday morning?
Yeah.
And then we'll give everybody 2 days to review it and get back to us. Any comments?
And next Tuesday, we don't plan to have another meeting because that's budget day, so we don't have a decision making, but as Steve mentioned, that we'll send a draft back to the big group. So some emails, make sure to check the emails on Tuesday. Tuesday and the Wednesday and try to get back to him and myself, like, if we have quick comments. Any further discussion or? All right, thank you so much.